Okay, so this is going to cover the kind of an introduction into the generative tools in Photoshop. I have two different renderings here, two different images of a project. I wanted to show how we can use generative tools to fill in entourage and make other adjustments in the image. These generative tools source from a list of images the same way other AI tools will, like Midjourney, Dolly, but they're gonna kind of do their best to give you the text that you're looking for. The difference between Photoshop and some of the others is that you can take an existing image that you have and edit it and have a little bit more control over the result versus having it just generate an entire image, and if you want to make a change you have to just kind of reiterate. With Photoshop you can select parts of the image and tell it kind of where you want a specific item or object or reflection, for example. So I'll just show you the workflow. So this is in Photoshop version 25. So this release has the generative tools in it. It's a kind of floating toolbar here. And so you'll notice I just have one layer here. This is the background image. What I'm going to do is select a region of the area here. I'm going to just select this, and clicking on this Generative Fill. When that happens, it asks for a prompt. So what would you like to generate? So I'm going to select this, and I'm going to type young man walking, enter. And you'll notice after working with this for a while, there's some things that it does well, other things that it struggles with. So we'll see, for example, how it handles people. It's going to use the image that you already have as kind of the style example or a source for it. And so you see it just dropped a person in it. There's certain things that it's going to try to solve. It did a good job of representing that floor or the ground here. That's kind of strange. And so you have different iterations of that, so different options you can choose from. Now, it struggles with people at the moment. I'm sure that's just going to get better with time, but you can take this and this is on its own layer, so you can move this, but notice it's taking the background with it, because it wasn't just adding a person, it was adding everything else that was in that rectangle that I drew. So it's going to kind of do its best to not only drop in the object or whatever text you told it for the prompt, it's going to try to kind of seamlessly blend that in with the context as well. And you'll notice, the boards on the ground here, it's even trying to match the perspective of those. So it's doing a decent job of that. So with people in Photoshop, in an architecture rendering, often we'll blur them anyway. So, for example, if I wanted to blur that person, if I were to just blur this whole layer, if I were to go filter, blur, motion blur, you notice it's not just blurring the person, it's going to blur the floor. So, you'd want to select it. There's different selection tools that Photoshop has that make grabbing an object a lot easier these days. So I can select just that person and then go to filter, blur, either Gaussian blur or motion blur in the case of this person who's walking. So you can add a motion blur to someone that way. Okay, so that's kind of one solution for just selecting a character or adding a person. Let's say we wanted to, another thing that Photoshop does pretty well is using this generative fill. You can add things like a wet ground. So if it just rained, that reflection is something that we often try to achieve in renderings. So I'm just going to use this polygon lasso tool to select this area here. And I'm going to use the generative tool or generative fill to say wet tile or wet deck with reflection. And so you're noticing the way that I'm adding this text. I'm not saying add a wet deck with reflection. I'm just telling it what it's what the object is or what my goal is here. So it's sourcing images from its database, compositing them, and weaving them into the image itself. So, you know, again, it'll take some iterations. You want to make sure that it's doing this right, but that's a pretty decent reflection. You can see how it's not only creating a reflection, it's considering the shadow. Right, the shadow that's being made here. It's adding ripples to the water, which again is a phenomena that happens naturally. I didn't tell it to add ripples, but it's sourcing images that have that included, so that's why that's an option. And then you'll get, you know, here's a reflecting pool, right? So it said, well, oftentimes a deck that's this color will have a reflecting pool, and so that's what's in the foreground. But you'll notice it's doing a great job of getting the reflection, right? It's not only the reflection of the original image of that building, it's adding the reflection of this person as well. So it's a pretty effective tool. You know, when you think about traditionally how long it would take to Photoshop a reflection and add, you know, wet ground, that's, you know, a lot of work typically. And then there's a portion here, you know, it's, again, the AI is just kind of going crazy with some of this stuff. So I want to remove this portion of it. And the way this works, right, this is a layer, and there's also a mask on it here too. So by clicking on the layer mask, I can go in with the paintbrush and I can set this to black. Hit the bracket icon on your keyboard and it'll increase the size or decrease it. And you can just, with black selected, I can remove that portion. I'm basically erasing it from the image, but I can always bring it back. So if I set this brush color to white, I can bring back any portion of that. And hit Control Z, because this is pretty good for now. So having a reflection in front of a building, it just makes the image more dynamic and engaging. You kind of see your reflection in the building. It just makes it look more dramatic. Another thing we can do, you'll notice this rendering has a sunset HDRI. So you can tell it's kind of a sunset lighting that's hitting the building, but this portion of the image is more of a blue sky, and I want to add a sunset to this. So what I'll do is select that portion of the building or of the sky, and I'm just going to grab this whole thing, because rather than having it try to match the existing trees, I'm just going to let the AI kind of determine what it wants to do for trees. It'll probably get us pretty close. So I'm going to select just that portion, and clicking on Generative Fill, I'm going to tell it golden hour sunset sky with trees in neighborhood. Hit generate. It's a pretty long prompt. We'll see how it solves that. So again, remembering how long this would take to Photoshop and to get the lighting, and it's doing a decent job of matching the tone, the kind of tonality of the image. So it'll do its best to try to solve that. This is also pretty good. That might be our best one. And so when you're considering the fact that, you know, previously, right, just this, these were modeled trees that were being rendered. They're not the most realistic looking trees, but with AI and kind of matching the tonality of the rest of the rendering, this does a really good job at kind of solving that. So we'll leave that. We can make this fence. If I don't want this kind of dark horizontal, I can go with maybe a different color. So there's different selection tools you can use. You know, you can do this kind of quick object selection. Nope. You can use the magic wand tool. I'm not in that. I'm gonna move this out of the way. So there's different ways you can select. You can use the lasso tool, polygon lasso tool. I'm just using this one as an example. Let's just use the polygon here. So I'm going to say Ipe fence with vertical, I'll say horizontal pickets. Ipe is a very durable wood. We'll see what it gets. Yeah, I think the pickets are probably confusing it. We'll say redwood fence. Keep it simple. Sometimes it'll get confused by language that it may not be expecting. So, you know, in adding another prompt to it just increases the number of options. I still have those old options here to choose from. But if I were to use this same thing and just hit generate, it'll generate 3 more options. So this is great for image editing, compositing an image. Let's say you have a rendering that you've taken from, you know, either V-Ray or Enscape or Lumion, and you want to add some more elements to it that you didn't have previously. Not sure if I like that. I would probably keep iterating, but again, if I don't like something, I'm just going to turn off that layer. Another thing we can add, I'm just going to select this region here and say add some birds. So we'll say flock of birds. This is another thing we often add in a rendering. There's various brush types in Photoshop that traditionally we would download in order to, you know, create things like birds. Let's see. Oh, I put it on this layer down here, so you're not seeing it. Oh, also it's using the images below it, so it was using the original background when it created this. So let's try this again. Now that it's up here, I'm just going to do the same thing. Flock of birds swarming. So I'm I want more of them. We'll see what happens here. So it should use the new sky that we have, yeah. So now it's using the new sky. And it does a pretty good job of that. You can kind of see the rectangle of that selection here. So one thing I might do is actually change the selection. So I'm just going to delete this layer. And so instead of selecting a rectangle, I'm just going to do this so that maybe it has a more smooth transition. Flock of birds, swarming. So all the entourage that we traditionally add to these renderings, you can pretty easily do. So depending on the type of image you want, I think this might be okay. And then I can select that layer, turn down the opacity if I want this to be more in the background. Another thing we often like to do is add rays of sunlight. So let's just see how this tool approaches sunlight. I'll just do this. You'll notice, so it's going to add rays of sunlight. It's also going to take a lot of liberties kind of figuring out the rest of this background. So I'm kind of curious to see what it's going to do. We can always edit the kind of boundary of it, but rays of sunlight. With a selection this big, we'll see how it interprets the rest of this. Yep, kind of strange. Technically, that's a ray of sunlight, but it's going to take a little work to get that to do what we want. I think part of it is the selection. It may not know kind of what we're going for here. I'm going to delete that. The other thing I noticed, I clicked on the background, so it put it just over that image, that layer. So if I start at the top and were to do that, I wonder if this will be any different. I'm just going to select this portion of it and say rays of sunlight. And again, you don't want to compromise on the design. So obviously it's adding a tree here, it's adding some background, and really not helping us with sunlight. So I have had success with that. It looks like it's not really working today, but it's going to take iterations and kind of working with the text prompt to make sure that it's creating what you want. Another thing we can do is actually increase the scope of the image. So let's say we wanted to have this house be have kind of a wider context. You can actually crop this to be wider than the image originally was, which is kind of amazing. So we can go to image, canvas size, increase the width of the canvas. So I'm going to set this to 80. So what I can do is select these portions here in here, and then without typing anything, just hit generate. And it should try to fill in the rest of that image based on the information that we've given it. So again, not a perfect solution the first time around, but it's continuing the fence, it's continuing the sunset. You know, it's continuing this grass that it only saw right here. That's pretty good for this side. So it's a pretty powerful tool. Like, it's getting the sunlight correct, right? It's more intense over here than the rest of the image. It even kind of has the perspective of the flooring. It's not perfect and it's kind of tapering off here, but that's not too bad for an image that was generated by AI. So you're seeing the AI kind of grab cues from the existing image when it's creating this. You'll see the same thing here. So this is a more cartoon style rendering. I think this is a really effective rendering technique when you don't either have a lot of time to create an image like this, or you don't want to have to go through the realistic rendering of something like that. This could be a really simple image that's exported from SketchUp or Rhino just by simply turning shadow on and having what's called a hidden line view, which is white surfaces, black line weights. So in Illustrator, I added vector people, I added vector plants, all before these AI tools came out, but I wanted to take this into Photoshop now and see what tools that what ways that we can add this stuff with AI. So I'm going to do the same thing that I did in the previous image, and you'll notice when I do it for this, it's going to kind of gather information from this image to kind of keep the style that it was drawn in without me having to say cartoon style. You'll see that I do that here and there, but for the most part, it's going to gather information from the image to fill in what's remaining. So I'm going to select this portion. I'm just going to say tree, generate. And so it's going to, again, gather source images from whatever data set that it has on the internet. It'll also read the image for inspiration and for kind of style cues to use. Okay, so not only did it add a tree that's pretty similar to this one, it filled in the rest of the sky with the same kind of dot pattern that I had for the sky here. Kind of with the same cartoon style, the same kind of color scheme. Okay, not all of them hit, right? Some of them missed, but this is pretty good for what we were looking for. And we can keep iterating if we wanted to keep going here, but I'm going to leave that one. So let's try selecting this. I'm going to say potted plants, enter. And testing this in the past has kind of yielded different results. Sometimes it's a more realistic plant. This one, okay, it's black and white, but still kind of cartoon-like, maybe matching some of the other ones that I had. Yeah, so I'm okay with that. I'm just going to turn down the opacity a little bit, but not too bad. And again, there's still kind of the artist's eye that's needed. You still have to kind of know when something works, when something doesn't. So it's not that it's going to fully replace the job of the designer. I think there's still, the room for the designer to clean things up, and it's just allowing us to get to this result a little bit faster. So yeah, you're seeing it add planting. It did a pretty good job of that sky. Let's see how it adds a window. I'm curious to see what it does here. So I'm just going to select this and say window without much more information than that. We'll see if it gets the perspective right. Okay, so it got the perspective right. Still kind of grayscale for that first one. I'm gonna hit generate again to give us 3 more options. And you'll notice, you know, sometimes it grabs one aspect of it, other times it's something else that you like, but it's just a matter of kind of finding what you're looking for. So yeah, maybe that's the one, and it's about just kind of selecting this and moving it up maybe. Just going to use the polygon. So yeah, there's, I think, a lot of really useful things that we can do. And again, you know, if you have a specific design and it starts modifying the design, make sure that you're trimming it and making sure your intention is coming through. You always have to check, you know, it's just like any other tool. You want to make sure that it's not giving you a result that you don't want. Sometimes it's okay to have something that's unexpected, but we always want to make sure we're curating the content and the output. So I'm going to add a person. We'll see if it grabs the style of the existing people in the image. Yeah, so not perfect, but the perspective looks right, cartoon style. And again, all of that is just from gathering information from the image. I didn't tell it cartoon person. I mean, there's tons of vector art you can download from online to get this stuff, but all right, so we got one real person. All right, more cartoon. So it'll take some kind of playing with this, and again, it has my original 3 in there too, but it's probably the closest we'll get. All right, so that's kind of the intro to the generative fill in Photoshop and how to use that in an architecture rendering.